Hello, welcome back to Della. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to understand a pattern so that you can make your own garments at home from patterns that you can buy from various places, such as like Hobbycraft or Amazon. This is one that was passed down to me and it's actually from 1966, which is crazy. But Simplicity still do patterns, so you can still get your hands on a Simplicity pattern. And this video is going to be for complete beginners, and I'm going to take you through all the key terms that you're going to need to know, and also how you can go about cutting out your size and then actually eventually sewing it together. So let's start by talking about the different sizes of a pattern. So the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at sizing and deciding what size we are and then how much fabric we're going to need associated with that size. So on the back of your pattern pack, you will have kind of this whole section typically. If it's not on the back, it might be on a sheet of paper inside the pattern pack. It will give you a kind of list of standardized measurements. So I will show you mine here. So at the bottom here, we can see the standardized measurements, and you're going to need to measure your body to see kind of what size you would fit into. If you would like to see a video on how to measure yourself correctly, then I'm happy to do that next week. And then up here, it's going to tell us, once we found out our size, it's then going to tell us how much fabric we need associated with that size. So for example, according to these measurements, I would be a size 10. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look further up, as I said, and then I would go to size 10 and then find how much fabric I'd need. So I would need 2.5 meters. Now, another thing to note with your pattern is usually when you pull your pattern out of the pack, it will come in kind of one big tissue paper with loads of various sizes on. I'll insert a picture of one now because I've actually already cut mine out. And what you want to do then is you either have two choices. Now you know your size, you could either directly cut out your size and just follow the line around exactly where it says your size. So for mine, I would directly follow around size 10 and cut that out. The other option is, obviously a lot of us change sizes over time, or maybe we actually just want to keep this pattern to make it for somebody else too later down the line. And to do this, you'll need some pattern paper, a pencil, and a tracing wheel, and potentially an awl as well. Now I'll put on screen what a tracing wheel and an awl look like. And a tracing wheel is basically got loads of tiny little edges, as you'll see in the photo, and you wheel it along over the pattern in order to create these little holes so you can basically trace it off really easily. And an awl is like basically got a little point at the end of it, and you can kind of stick this into different places on your pattern to trace that off as well. And you'd usually use an awl for something like the darts or the notches. Okay, so now we'll assume that we've cut out our pattern to the size that we would like. I'll show you mine laid out. So this is what our pattern looks like once I've laid it out. This is a beginner's pattern, so it actually only has 5 pieces in total that we'll need. And as you can see, it's quite crumpled. I mean, this one has been away for a long time, but yours will also potentially be crumpled as they are folded up into those tiny packs. So now my advice would be to actually press your pattern just so it's nice and flat. It's very easy to work with and we get the sizing accurate. So now I'm going to take you through some key terms that are essential to learning the basics of pattern cutting. So the first one is our pattern in general, and this is a template or a guide that's used to cut out the fabric into the correct shape and size that you need in order to create a garment. So all of these individual pieces are called pattern pieces. The next essential one that you need to know is the grain line, and this is the symbol for the grain line, and this is the direction of the fabric threads which are shown on your pattern as I've just shown. And the grain line is basically essential for aligning the pattern correctly when you're putting it onto the fabric. So I'll put an image on screen now, but when you're referring to the grain line, on your fabric, there's always a lengthways grain, which is called the warp, and this runs parallel to the selvage, which is the finished edge. And then you have the cross grain, which is the weft, and this runs perpendicular to the selvage. We also then have the bias, which is, if we're looking at our piece of fabric, it's cutting it along the diagonal. So you're placing your grain line on the diagonal. The next key term you'll need to know is seam allowance. And seam allowance is typically marked by dashes on your pattern. And this is basically the extra space added on top of the correct size so that there's space to sew them together. So typically I either see seam allowance being 1 centimeter or 1.5. In this case, it's 1.5, and it will usually tell you somewhere along the seam allowance line. Now, next up we have notches, and these are usually marked by tiny little triangles on your pattern. As you can see, this has already been cut out by whoever had this before I inherited it. But basically the notches are small marks or cuts that are made in the fabric to indicate matching points. So it's basically where you match up the seams with the other pattern. So for example, this will match up with this, as there's also a single notch here, and that's basically creating the side seam. We then have the darts, which, as you can see here, it's a dart example, and this is a fold sewn into the fabric to provide shape. So obviously this is a women's dress, so it's fitted so that it goes around the bust really nicely, and these little points here are so that you can mark with your awl if you're going to trace it round. Now, in terms of facing, this is an example of the armhole facing for this dress, and in these beginner packs you will typically get a separate pattern for the facing. I also have one here for the front neck, and basically the facing is a piece of fabric that's sewn onto the inside of your garment to finish the edges, such as around the necklines or the armholes. So basically exactly what I have here. Another thing that's really important to note, but is not necessarily a key term, is on each pattern piece, it will tell you exactly how many you need to cut, and also what pattern piece it is and the size of the pattern piece. And this just basically makes it super clear every time you pick up the pattern piece what it is. So for example here, it says cut 2, so we know to cut 2, and we also know it's the armhole facing. So we know we need 2 of the armhole facing. We also know from the key terms that I showed you how we're going to place this on the grain and where this grain line is going to go, and as I said, we're going to put it directly parallel to the selvage. We also know, as noted here, that the seam allowance is 1.5 centimeters. So when you go onto your machine, you'll need to put your needle 1.5 centimeters in from the edge. So now that we know all of the key terms, the next thing that you'll need to do is actually pin your pattern down onto your fabric. And I'll put a quick reminder on the screen as to where your grain line's going. So you have the warp and the weft, and you're typically, unless it states otherwise in your pattern, putting your grain line parallel to the selvage. So you're going to pin your pattern down, and then you either have 2 options. You can cut it out straight with scissors, or if you find that a bit time consuming and a bit lengthy, you can use a rotary cutter. Just make sure you have a self-healing mat underneath so you don't accidentally cut into your floors or your table or anything like that. Once you've cut out your pattern, you also want to cut your notches. So we learned what the symbol for a notch was earlier. It's basically that little triangle. I'll put it on the screen now. And in order to cut out the notch, we basically just either do a tiny snip incision, or we can cut out the little triangle. I personally prefer cutting out the little triangle, just don't make it too big, as this is much clearer to me than when I'm matching them up, rather than trying to find tiny incisions. But other people prefer the tiny incisions if they don't want to make too much of an incision. Another thing to note when you're pinning down your pattern is that sometimes in your big pack, it will actually tell you an advised layout for the pattern pieces onto the fabric to basically maximize the space and also ensure you cut it out correctly. So So in this example, as you can see, they give multiple options of how to cut out your pattern pieces in accordance with various sizes. Each pattern piece also has a letter on it or a number, which then corresponds to the letter or number on the sheet here. This just makes it super clear and easy for anyone to follow, and you also know if you follow the way they lay out their pattern pieces that you'll have enough room. However, sometimes I like to kind of jig it around in order to maximize the space and also use up as much fabric as I can, so there's less waste. Once you cut out your pattern pieces, you're then going to refer to this sheet again, as this is your instruction sheet. So on the back of most of these sheets will be a whole set of basic instructions, and it really does, especially if you get a beginner pattern, it will really take you through kind of each step quite simply. And as long as you have the key terms noted down, you'll easily be able to refer to them. So I'm actually going to attach a list of key terms in a PDF, and then you can access it as you wish. So it's really easy for you to refer to them. And that is basically a summary of how to understand your patterns. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to pop them in the WhatsApp group. And thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.